Hello, this is Stone G with Mind, the Autism podcast. And today we are blessed and fortunate to be with a psychologist, therapist, hypnotherapist. And I'm just going to call you Dr. Alink and share share a little bit about your journey, because I know that one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you is because you are also neurodiverse. And as a
Right.
clinician, you not only have the academic part of it, you have the science, you also have the lived experience. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey, and please share with everyone your background.
All right. Thank you for welcoming me. So nice to meet you, like all over the other end of the world. I'm sitting here in rainy Amsterdam today. It's afternoon here. Um, yeah, I'm based in Amsterdam, and I'm currently finishing my study for integrative psychotherapy and hypnosis. And I love to work with people, and especially with neurodiverse people. I found out along the way that I am neurodiverse myself. I have autism and ADHD, which gives challenges of its own. But I really like to help people with the same struggles that I experience. So
Mm,
that's in a nutshell a bit about me.
mm. You bring up something interesting, because there's your lived experience, and then there is uh, your academic experience. And still, even though you have the science where you understand what's going on, you're still describing these struggles with
Mhm.
neurodiversity. And I wonder if you could share maybe some specific examples of challenges that you had, and maybe land the plane with what you did to resolve it.
Sure. So what I experience myself is mostly sensory issues, challenges. I'm very sensitive to lights and noises. So when I get out into the world, out of my house, my safe zone, it comes in like in stereo, like really loud. And so I wear headsets like everywhere I go. I'm always wearing earplugs. And if I don't do that, the world comes in too big and too loud for me, and it gives me anxiety. So that's what I notice a lot. Like when there's too many people, crowded places, and there's too many conversations going on, or sounds. Like I pick up all the sounds; they're not filtered. So then it's sometimes hard to focus if I'm speaking to someone and there's something else going on, and then I hear a siren or I see a bird. It's all over the place. So that's mainly what I experienced in the outside world. And another thing I experience is executive functioning that's affected with me. I noticed that with, for example, planning, keeping track of time. I have time blindness, they call it. So to me, time doesn't really exist, and I struggle to live in the world with time and keep track of everything. So even though I know I have an appointment or I need to go to school, and I take all the time in advance and I put many alarms, I still struggle in the end to make it out of the door in time. So it's always, like I'm running after the facts, and I need to make sure that I arrive somewhere in time.
Mm. And it sounds, it's a beautiful thing that you have these challenges, and you also want to support other people with these same challenges. And it sounds to me that you've organized some type of structure, strategy to address that. And so you said with the noise and light, so when you're at home, maybe you don't have the lights on as much, and you wear earplugs everywhere you go. And what have you done with executive function to shore that up?
Yeah, that's still one of the main points I struggle with because it's so invasive. so to speak. So I really have to put effort into it. For example, I use my timer on my phone a lot. If I have to prepare something for school or study or client sessions, I really have to sit down and use a timer. And I prefer to work in time slots. So, for example, I set it for 40 minutes, and then I take a small break. And it works really well for me to have these intermittent working sections, and then a small reward, because that works really well with my brain to keep me motivated. I believe there's apps for it as well. Like, what's the name again? Perhaps you know the one, like Tomatoes,
Sure.
something
Yeah,
like that.
there's two others. One is called Sensa, which is pretty good, and another one called Motion. Those are seem to be the top, the most popular ones. Well, I'm also curious about. I want to shift the conversation a little bit, and maybe if we could just look at autism itself. I know
Mhm.
for me, when my doctor suggested that I'm autistic, I had heard of it, but I didn't know what it was. And maybe you can share from, as a clinician, if you could share from a clinical perspective, what is autism?
That's a really good question because autism is hard to put in one box, because it's so diverse, and they call it a spectrum, and it plays out differently for every single individual. So you can have one person with autism and another one, and they can be completely different in their expressions. Um, so how I would describe it is that it's a neurological condition. It's something that's actually in the brain and in the nervous system. And these people are much more sensitive. And these sensitivities play out in different realms. So one person struggles more with like the sensory effect, or with the tactile effects, that they don't like touch or hugs. Another person struggles really badly with executive functioning, with anxiety, with depression. um, so it's hard to capture it under one explanation. It's complex. It's very complex, and that makes it really interesting. So I think it's important to look at every person as an individual and see how their sensitivities play out. And there's an interesting concept of a psychologist, Dr. Dabrowski. Have you heard of him?
Not as of yet.
Okay, so what he did at the time, he developed a concept, and he called it overexcitabilities. And it sounds very similar to autism. And what he did is measure specific realms where the sensitivity can play out. And for example, you have it in the motor realm. Like, a lot of people struggle with their movements, with their coordination, with balance, dropping things. And then there's the sensory realm, like with all the senses, the data that comes in. In all these realms, people with autism are much more sensitive than
Mm,
neurotypicals. So I
mm,
like to see it that way, and through the lens of overexcitabilities and sensitivities.
mm. Yeah, I'll just for our listeners, I'll let me see if I can distill all that, because that's as you
It's a
said,
lot.
it's broad. And one of the challenges is that sometimes, in particular, neurotypical people, or people who are engaged in ableism, will say autism is X or autism is Y, and it isn't a monolith. It's not just this one. It's quite broad. But let's try to encapsulate it. The way I usually encapsulate it for my clients is that it is a difference in neurology from the way neurotypical people might relate to the world. And one of the common elements with autism is that we tend to our senses tend to be 40% more active than neurotypical people, so we feel a lot more. Um, that's one way of describing it, and I think that would you say that's fair? That's a fair way of encapsulating what you shared.
Definitely. I like how you actually gave like a fact or a number with it. That works well with people with autism to have a clear logical or scientific cue, like 40% more sensory intensity or input. I like that.
Mm,
And I also heard the term intense worldview one time. I read it somewhere, or I heard it. I think that also is a nice way to put it, that everything comes in more intense and is experienced more intense.
mm. I my with regarding my lived experience, I always knew that I was different, and I didn't quite know why. I thought it was because I'm a beautiful chocolate man, or maybe it was, oh, because I'm so tall, or these. But it was none of those. I'm being tongue in cheek with that. Um, but we know, and there are a few. There's some peer-reviewed literature that has demonstrated that neurotypical people tend to be marginalized immediately. There was a study where they took several neurotypical people, and they took one uh, neurodiverse person, and without fail, all of the neurotypical people marginalized the neurodiverse person. Then they reversed the study, and the neurodiverse, so it was a group of neurodiverse people and a neurotypical person. And the neurotypical person self-selected out, whereas the neurodiverse people, they were fine. They were interacting, they were communicating. So there's a myth that uh, neurodiverse people have an issue with communication. No, we don't have an issue with communication. We have an issue with trauma and the marginalization that happens with neurotypical people marginalizing us or excluding us because we're different. We communicate differently. We interact differently. So I'm curious about some of your experiences in academia, especially once you became aware of your neurodiversity and working in or training uh, in this type of area.
Could you repeat the question? Because the connection went a bit on and off, so I
Oh,
didn't hear
sure.
you. Mhm.
Sure. My question was if you could share your experience through a neurodiverse lens of being in academia.
Sure. So, like you said, like when I was younger, I already noticed there was something different about me, but I couldn't really pinpoint it. I just thought I was weird, or there was something different about me. So I really noticed it at high school and college. And I felt a bit lost there. And I was still very introverted, and I struggled with, social activities. I was a bit of a loner. I didn't have that many friends. I got bullied. And when I started the current academia, the psychology and the integrative therapy and hypnotherapy, I entered a different environment, because what is interesting about this study is that it's a bit out of the box. It's for some reason a lot of neurodivergent people pick this study. So I entered class and environment with people like me. And at first I didn't realize it, but I started to recognize it more and more, because in the beginning I had no clue yet that I was neurodivergent until I had sessions with a therapist. And in the very first session, he mentioned, Ella, I believe you're on the autism spectrum. And I got mad, because I was like, this is not possible. Like, I didn't believe it. And it took me a while to actually adjust to even considering that diagnosis. And the funny thing is that, once I started to acclimatize and mentally adjust to that big change of perception and of acknowledging this, I started to look back at my life, and I could recognize all these things. And suddenly, once you open up to that, the idea starts to get alive, and I started to accept it more and more. And I read a lot about it online, and I started to, get more knowledgeable on it and map it to my own experiences. And what I realized then, what I find really remarkable, is that once you accepted yourself and you get to know yourself better and your autistic traits, and you're able to see, this is going on, then you're able to recognize it in others. So once I got it was an unofficial diagnose, but since then, I I started to see it around me, like, hey, and I also saw in my network that a lot of people in my network that I hang out with are neurodivergent. It's like
Mm.
that energetically we navigate towards each other.
Yeah, birds of a feather flock together. I
That's
I
that's
was
the saying, yeah.
I was smiling because next term I start so I'm doing a dual degree next term, and I start psychology, and the head lecturer is also autistic, and when I'm interacting with other autistic people, uh, I would say more than 50% of them have an interest in psychology, um, and or they're studying it, or they are a psychologist. And when I look at my own lived experience, I am a neurolinguistic programmer, a master therapist. Uh, I'm I'm a counselor, a hypnotherapist. So there are all these, and a coach, and there are all these modalities that I've participated in and become qualified in and developed competence and mastery in over my life, because I thought there was something wrong with me. I was trying to fix myself, and come to find out there was nothing wrong. And I believe that that is usually just like you were expressing. There's a similar journey that we experience.
Definitely, yeah, it's true what you're saying, that people that navigate towards psychology, that have a big interest in it, are people that want to find out something about themselves. Either they think like, oh, there's something wrong with me, I need to fix something, or there's always this reason that next to helping people, they also want to help themselves and figure out what's going on there.
Right. What would you say? Let's let's take a hypothetical. Let's say you have a client who is coming to you, and they're newly diagnosed. Maybe they got a diagnosis within the past 12 months. And let's say you have, again, this is hypothetical. And let's say you have another client who has come to you, and they were diagnosed maybe 15 years ago. What do you think are going to be some of the differences in the way they present, or what do you think are going to be some of the issues that they're negotiating?
hmm So, for a newly diagnosed person or a person exploring the possibility of being autistic, that's a whole process. And next to acceptance, it's also a kind of grieving process, because their entire world suddenly changes. And yeah, you're going to backtrack and look back on your life, and suddenly things start to make sense. Like, oh, now I understand why this and this happened, or why this didn't happen, or why I struggled so badly. So there's a lot of realizations that people have to digest. So it takes some time, and they have to like get to know themselves all over again, basically, because there's masking involved. And suddenly it's like, oh, what part is me and what part was masked? So this can go hand in hand with like a grieving process or depression, even, to adjust to that new information and that new perception suddenly, because you're going to look at yourself in a completely different way. So these people need more guidance in their journey, how they can deal with that best.
Mm,
And what I also see is with people newly diagnosed, that they're not so aware yet about the emotional realm and how to actually put language to it. So I work a lot with metaphors with those clients, whereas people that are further ahead in their journey, they reach that acceptance. They accept themselves as they are, and they know that there was never anything wrong with them, and they went through their whole process of acceptance and perhaps grieving or whatever changes they go through, and they also start to learn more and express themselves better. So they improve a lot in the communication realm, the social realm, emotional intelligence realm. They really make progress. So there's a lot of difference.
Mm. And can you say a little bit more about the clients who may have had a diagnosis for 15 years? What are some of the challenges that they might present with?
Um, what I see is that they really get to know themselves better, and they have kind of like a um, they want to explore themselves more and make a lot of changes in their lives, because their whole lives they've been masking and they've been just doing whatever, and then they enter a process that they want to change their career, they want to change their relationship, they really want to do now that they discovered themselves and worked on really getting to know who they are. So you see, like, they're making steps there, to pursue, their own things, and
Mm,
they learn to set boundaries much better. Because if you're not diagnosed, then there's a lot of struggle with boundaries, and that's a lot of blurred. So people further ahead, they really know what their boundaries are. They can take better care of themselves, and yeah, that's a completely different picture then.
mm. Something I've noticed with people who may have got a diagnosis as a child is sometimes they get the diagnosis, but then they will ignore it. They will say, "This is not a part of my identity." And it's akin to, let's say you're a woman, which you are, and
As far as I know.
and for whatever reason you decide that I'm not going to identify as woman. I'm not going to identify as anything. And if someone calls me a woman, I'm going to get upset. And because that's not part of my identity. And so I've noticed that behavior in people who've had a diagnosis for a long time. And then I've noticed the polar opposite, where people who have had a diagnosis for 15 or more years are real champions and advocates in the industry. And I'm thinking of one colleague, and she uh, refuses to have a filter. Her policy is she will never mask, she will never filter. She says exactly what she's thinking, and she's always right. And she doesn't care about other people's feelings. She just wants the truth. And I find her refreshing. 'Cause I'm autistic, but neurotypical people don't always appreciate her forthrightness. So let me just recap some of the things that you said about newly diagnosed people. So they tend to, and I'm just looking at my notes because I was doing a little typey while you I apologize. So you were saying that newly diagnosed people, they tend to deal with acceptance, which is accepting themselves, like, wow, I'm autistic. How can I accept that? And then they go through a grief cycle, where they've had an identity or a picture or a perception of themselves, and now it's different. And so there's the death of the old self, and this emergence, this struggle of the new self, that they, because they can only keep going forward. And then there's some depression with that. And they tend to try to identify, well, what's masking, what's not masking, and and part of that conversation is also the deconstruction of ableism, because sometimes they have this map of certain behaviors that are very neurotypical, and they might make themselves wrong for not being able to be their true self, not being able to be fully self-expressed. So that's I realize that that is a challenge, and it's also exciting.
Definitely, yeah. You captured that very well. It's nice to hear back a summary of what I actually said. That helps me, to hear back my own words and verify. Like, yeah, that's it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So it's a lot of things that are involved in that change process, and I like how you put it. Like, yeah, there's the identity. It's very important. Like you said, people that get newly diagnosed, they first deny it. That's also part of the grief process, the Kubler-Ross cycles of grief. The first step is denial. um,
Mm.
and I experienced it myself. Like, when my therapist told me, I was like, nope, that's not me. Denial. So yeah, it's very relatable, what you said. And also the moving from the masking to suddenly, like, all masks off, and that lady that that's just unfiltered. And that's where the collision happens between neurotypical and neurodivergent, because we live in a filtered world and everyone adapts. And when you just speak your truth, people cannot handle it. So that's why a lot of times people with autism get bullied, because they just speak the truth. They are unfiltered, and we live in
I
a filtered world.
Yeah, I've for a long time I've been an advocate of a neurodivergent state or a neurodivergent community. Uh, there are pros and cons of that, obviously, and I really enjoy I enjoy the nuances and the possibility of creating something like that, since it's never been done before. Uh, but more and more, there's this argument out there where people are saying the there's an increase of autistic diagnoses, so more people are showing up as autistic, and from just from math, if we look at statistics, there are more human beings on the planet, and also as science improves, our diagnostic process is getting better. So it's not as if it's not as if there are more people showing up with autism. There's nothing in the air. That's like saying, oh, there's more men who are being born, or there's more women who are being born. No, we've always been here. It's just now we have a name for it. Now we are able to conceptualize it and categorize it. And when we look at the necessity of
Mm.
autism in human tapestry, our future is very, very bright. And this is our first time having a conversation, our first podcast. I'm tickled, as you can see. I'm very happy to have had this opportunity to connect with you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversations in the future. And with that, I'd like to give you the closing word.
Mhm. Well, thanks a lot, for inviting me. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was like, it went so fast. I was like, is it finished already? So that's a good sign, Like, I noticed, like, these topics are close to both our hearts, and there's so much material we could discuss about. So I really loved it, and I would like to, like, pick up on where we left off, some other time, so we can explore, more, because there's a whole world of neurodiversity and so many more things we can, dive
Yes,
into. So thank you for the
yes,
opportunity. I really enjoyed
we
it.
just we just put our pinky in the water this time, and
Exactly.
maybe next time
Hmm.
we can jump in really deep. I will be putting your contact information at the bottom of the video, so that if people who want to get in touch with you or have a conversation with you, or they want to explore the therapy options for neurodiversity, that they'd be able to get in contact with you. And in saying that, I just want to share with our audience that just because you're neurodivergent or autistic or whatever your flavor is, it does not mean that there's something wrong with you. It also doesn't mean that you need therapy. Therapy is really useful for trauma, for reconciling identity type things and attachment issues and blah, 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 blah. But that is not so being autistic does not mean that something is wrong with you. I just want to make sure that our audience understands that. So contact contact a therapist and make sure that they're culturally competent, and make sure that they have a practice that is neurodivergent informed. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for your interest, and I look forward to having another conversation with you on Mind the Autism podcast.